Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. So in the past, when I've done my breakdown videos looking at Hollywood productions, I always show it with the EL zone. A few folks reached out to me. They had some kind of critiques about how I shouldn't be putting the EL zone on the Rec 709 look or the show LUT of these productions. It is a fair take, and what I did for this video is I reverse engineered the look of the Penguin. So basically, I found out that the show was shot on ARRI. So we know that they captured it in ARRI LogC. So then I just reverse engineered it with a color transformation in DaVinci Resolve. And so now we are able to look at this properly, pretty dang close to what it would have looked like on the day on set if they were using EL zone. They as being the filmmakers of The Penguin. Even though Greig Fraser didn't shoot this series, he did have a huge influence on it. Much like most TV shows, there was a few different DPs that worked on this, so shout out to Darren Tiernan, David Franco, Jonathan Freeman, and Zoe White. However, if we wanted to figure out who the DP that should be credited with the way the show looks, beyond Greig Fraser just being a huge influence on it, we should look at the pilot, or episode 1. And we see the cinematographer on that was Darren Tiernan. So he is the one that can be accredited for coming up with the show look, maybe even the LUT with the DIT, the real DIT, not the DMT. Two big differences there. Difference between a media wrangler versus a true digital imaging technician. I've talked about that in past videos. You'll have to go watch my other videos after you watch this one. So I've broken this down. We got quite a few grabs to look at, and I've broken this down in the 4 basic setups. Every setup known to man is going to be one of 4 things: day interior, day exterior, night interior, night exterior. That's just how it goes across the board. So that is why the American Society of Cinematographers have suggested when you're putting your reels together, they want to see that you know how to actually light in day interiors, day exteriors, night exteriors, and try to avoid documentary footage. This is the EL zone put on the Rec 709 show look, right? The LUT that they used for this show. You can see that the majority of his face is about 3 stops under. However, when we see what it looks like on the ARRI LogC, well, now we know, like, oh, okay, it was actually only the majority of his face was 2 stops under. So now we're going to get into some basic housekeeping here before we get into this breakdown. Because I had a lot of complainers, a lot of critiques in the past of people saying, do you really think that Hollywood is underexposing their shots? Well, yes, clearly they are. We know that now. This is very, very close to what they would have actually been looking at on set on the day, because this is the ARRI LogC with EL zone put on it. And this is what I'm talking about. It's astounding to me the amount of folks that think that everyone, including big Hollywood, is metering all of their shots to middle gray. Exposing to middle gray is actually going to make a flat image. Yes, they do underexpose because that's the whole point of dynamic range. Now, I've done a whole video, you'll have to go back and find it, about how you can use the ISO of your specific camera sensor to your advantage, okay? The way real Hollywood cinematographers use the modern digital cameras with the ISO is the same way that they pushed and pulled film back in the film days. Basically, if we were to look at this as a film person, right, we would go, oh, they pulled it 2 stops, right? Which means they pulled it back under middle gray, technically underexposing 2 stops, because that's what they did. So in the film days, they would call that pulling. And if you go the other way, they call it pushing. Well, nothing has changed. We're still doing that today. The difference is nowadays, the modern digital sensors have arguably more dynamic range, certainly in the shadow areas, than film does, right? Because digital is the opposite of film. If you overexpose film, it actually works better. But if you start underexposing film, it kind of falls apart and gets really, really super grainy, right? Especially depending on how sensitive the film is, right? Versus digital, it actually can benefit from underexposing and can really clip out and get really nasty if you overexpose it. That's the whole point of why I did my breakdown of how to properly expose red digital cinema cameras, whether it's DSMC2 or DSMC3 bodies. Again, all of these videos are on this channel. If you're new here, welcome. And I hope you tap that subscribe button, because this is what we do here. We get into the really nitty-gritty of how these images are being made in true Hollywood. Let's pretend we're on the set of The Penguin, right? We have our ARRI LogC log image that we're looking at, and then they click on the EL zone, and this is what they would be looking at. So I have my Sekonic light meter here, right? And let's say that they took a reading, and for whatever reason, the key light was giving them an f4 with their camera settings. So when they're looking at this log image, let's just pretend they were getting a 4 on the key light. But we know by looking at the EL zone, when the EL zone is applied to that ARRI LogC image, we know, and keep in mind this EL zone is color mapped. You know, before I captured this screen grab, I did run the proper ARRI LogC through the EL zone color pipeline, okay, just so we're all up to date here. We know by looking at this that they're not sitting at 4s if the meter was showing 4, because if they were, his face would be the middle gray color, which is 18% gray there in the middle. No, we know by looking at this, the EL zone chart is showing us that they're actually underexposing 2 stops. The majority of his face is mainly 2 stops under. There are some little patches of 1, maybe half a stop under, and then the rest around him we can see is 3 and 4 stops under. In other words, if they would have said, oh, this is a 4, let's light his face to a 4, it would not be it wouldn't be this look. It would be a different show. That people tried to challenge me on this in my past EL zone videos. It's like, yes, this is how they're capturing. They are underexposing. They are pushing the limits of that specific sensor because they've done the proper testing of whatever sensor they're shooting on in the pre-production process. That's how it's done. I did a whole video on this about how to properly use your ISO to your advantage. I took it straight out of the American Society of Cinematographers manual, the most recent edition. You can find that on this channel. We did some house cleaning there. I hope we're all caught up. If this is way, way over your head, then you may have to check out my other videos. What are we going to get out of this, right? What are we going to take away from looking at how they were exposing on the day? Well, we know that this was the final exposure because this was the shot that made it in the show. We know that right off the bat. But I'm almost positive this is actually a day shot. This looks night, right? A lot of the day interiors are sometimes hard to distinguish. Well, is this captured at night or day, right? Or is it supposed to, we all know it was done in studio, first of all, but is it supposed to be day interior or night interior? But we can see here, that's clearly, okay, there's with the show LUT, that's clearly a day interior, okay? So if we go to the close-up shot of that for both of them, you know, because if you didn't know any better, if you didn't know that window was there, you would think this was a night interior. That's how kind of dimly lit this whole show is, right? It's very nuanced. That was the show look, and then that's the ARRI LogC image. This is the EL zone on the ARRI LogC versus this is the EL zone on the show LUT, right? So they're flicking this on and off. This is what he's doing with his digital imaging technician, a real DIT. And the reason why I harp on that is because so many people, even here in LA, I see job boards on the job boards, job submissions, looking for a DIT, but they're not. They're looking for a media wrangler, a DMT. Huge difference, guys. So that's why I put so much emphasis on that. A real DIT is the guy who lives in the tent on set, and he's developed the show LUT and the look with the DP. They work very close. A real DIT is helping the cinematographer balance the exposure on the day. That's the reality of it, okay? These are simple things you learn if you go to a real film school or if you take classes on Skillshare. That's a perfect segue into today's sponsor. My wife and I's documentary channel has finally launched our first official episode of our documentary channel. It's at Local Calls Photo, and Skillshare has been cool to find some cool classes to kind of give us a refresher on documentary filmmaking, especially when it comes to writing and actually structuring stories, which can be very hard to do with a documentary. So we've been taking this class, Documentary Filmmaking, Write, Film, and Edit a Short Documentary by Olaf de Flue, and it's been a really cool learning experience. What I love most is just how practical the course is. You're not just watching, you're doing. It has really helped me and my wife find effective ways to tackle ideas and actually bring them to life. And there are plenty more courses. They got cinematography classes, DaVinci Resolve, color grading classes, and something I'm super excited about since, the documentary is about street photography, they have the GOAT on there, Andre Wagner. Okay, I'm super stoked about this. If you don't know about Andre, he's amazing. He just did a photo shoot with the other GOAT of hip-hop, Kendrick Lamar, and Andre has awesome courses on Skillshare, both in developing black and white, which is rad because I recently started developing and scanning my own black and white, so this is so perfect, and also he has a whole course on just his approach to street documentary photography in general. So Skillshare, if you haven't heard of it, is the largest online learning platform for creatives. It's all designed by creatives for creatives. What's really cool is that the first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So if you've got something you've been wanting to learn or improve, click the link below and get started today. Okay, back to the EL zone. Let's look at this and let's start breaking this down. Why is this so helpful? Well, this is a great way for you to do this on any of the shows that you admire, or, you know, a lot of people talk about Shot Deck. Shot Deck is a cool resource. However, imagine if you could take those shots, figure out what cameras those were shot on, reverse engineer them with a simple color space transform node in DaVinci Resolve, slap the EL zone on there by dialing in the correct color pipeline, and then boom, then it'll be pretty dang close to what they would be looking at on set on the day of that production. So this is highly beneficial for understanding the contrast ratios, which is something I did a whole video on it, also featuring the EL zone, but also just understanding the nuance of the image, how they got the image, maybe even the placement of the lighting. We know, I mean, by me just looking at this, I know like, okay, this is very Godfather style. And we can just see that by where the majority of the light is falling on his face. You could also identify the position of the lighting just by looking at the image without EL zone. However, with EL zone, you can instantly see it immediately, but also you can see it by the stop values. And remember, this is how it looks on the log versus what it looks like with the show look. Let's analyze it the way that the show makers intended for us to analyze it. However, if we really want to be technical and know really what they're doing, well then, yeah, that's why it's better to look at it on the log image. So then we can really see how they captured it. But at the end of the day, yes, they were in fact capturing it 2 stops under. We can clearly see that. If we keep moving on with that scene, now we see the kind of reverse shot of his mom holding him. Now this is with the log. I mean, this is dark. This is the way it was captured. Again, keep in mind, these are the EL zone applied to the ARRI LogC. 100% you can capture an image under. That's the whole point of the dynamic range of the camera. So for everyone out there whining and complaining about these cameras don't have enough dynamic range, well, by the amount of criticism that I get when I talk about the EL zone, I talk about how real Hollywood is capturing images, I get so much pushback by people thinking, like, yelling at me that they're not underexposing. Well, clearly they are. It's the reality of their understanding where they want to push and pull that specific camera's ISO. It's just like the film days, guys. But the biggest difference is the digital sensors, you can really push the underexposure far, far further than you could push film. But if we think about this, like when I did my breakdowns of Red Digital Cinema and how it works with their goalposts and their traffic stops, if the traffic lights come on in the overexposure regions, that means that you have clipped the red, green, or blue channels by 2%. And you don't want to go beyond that. You don't want to start filling up the goalposts on the overexposure side at all, because anything beyond 2% is going to be pretty much unrecoverable. It's very hard. Meanwhile, on the underexposure side, and this is straight out of the Red manual, I've done a whole video on this, on the underexposure side, you can let that goalpost fill up halfway on the underexposure side and still have recoverable. So this is what I'm saying, guys. Don't be afraid to understand the limits of your sensor. So we know that, yes, they are definitely capturing this at 2 stops under. When we're on the mom here, because she's in so much shadow of the looming penguin, right? She's, you know, and this also gives you idea of kind of maybe the foo-foo philosophy behind the exposure capture of these images, right? You know, her whole life has been encumbered by this beast of a man, right? And we constantly see it even in the shots, in the cinematography, and the exposure of it, right? So this is what I like to talk a lot about even on my own Patreon is, you know, so many people on our YouTube camera world universe here, our little corner of the YouTube cinematography world, is so many people, yeah, they want to talk about cinematography, they want to show sexy B-roll, and they want to show, you know, lighting that's been done for decades, right? And think that they're like doing something new and innovative. But the reality is the innovation of cinematography comes in how you interpret the script, right? So this is why I'm always putting so much flack on guys that call themselves filmmakers, and yet they haven't actually done real scripts. They haven't actually shot real films, right? So for people to say, well, the stuff I put on YouTube is a real film, sure, but it was self-produced by you. You wrote the script, you produced it, which is great. I applaud that. However, it's easier to interpret a script when it came out of your mind. Now imagine if you had to interpret a script that you were hired to interpret as a cinematographer, as a real director of photography. It's a big difference, guys. If our end goal is to be a Hollywood director of photography, well then I would think that you would want to shoot as many narrative projects as possible. Right? Okay? And the whole reason is because that's the training for Hollywood. You can't just shoot a bunch of Instagram videos and YouTube shorts and then one day think you're going to get hired and know exactly what you're going to do on a real Hollywood set. it's a whole different world, guys, right? So that's kind of why I harp on this stuff so much, and why I am so analytical about it, and really, you know, criticizing of it and judgmental of others on it. I'm sorry I'm going down rabbit holes. I do digress. If you're new here, you know I'm neurodivergent and I hop all over the place. But let's look at these scenes, right? Let's look at what Patrick O'Sullivan, the wandering DP, calls the credit card shot. Okay, this would technically be a form of the credit card shot, and why he calls it the credit card shot is because it's generally when someone has something on a table or something. It's a product. It's always done in product, and it's like over the shoulder style. This is kind of almost the reverse credit card shot. You know, it's kind of more frontal than over the shoulder, but it's still technically a credit card shot. And we can see where the majority of the light is coming from. Now, keep in mind the EL zone is on the ARRI LogC, so this is pretty damn close, identical to what it would look like on set on the day. And we can see the majority of the light is coming from this region back here. We know that that's where the ambient light is living. We could say that's where the room tone is living, right? Shane Herbert's infamous room tone, right? We know that's where that's living, and it's being pushed and carried over here to the record player, i.e. the credit card, right? Or the product, right? If this was a product shot. But we can see there is also that same amount of level, right? Because it's not changing, right? His hand isn't getting hotter than this area. The only real hot area is this area of the record player, right? And that's just more of the reflective surface of the record. This is obviously the room tone being pushed. You know, it's kind of perfectly backlighting his hand. But then we do know by looking at this, certainly because of this hot spot here, these hot spots on the actual record, and the amount of fall off on his hand, we know that there is actually something else up top here coming down, right? And it's being super controlled, whether it's with egg crate grids or some kind of skirt or floppies or something. It is being controlled to not kind of spill out over this way, right? They're still containing it, so it's just mainly about the record player. It is spilling a little bit on his hand, but still not much because his hand is matching the ambient room tone back here, right? This is why I find this so fascinating and I geek out on this stuff. And this is all the same setup, right? This is all the same scene, what we just looked at with him and his mom dancing. This is all the same. So we're looking at the product shot here, like the extreme close-up of the record player. We already looked at this one, kind of the medium tight coverage of his mom. We looked at the kind of close-up of his coverage there. But we can't forget that we see this when he walks in the room, but we'll come back to that. But this is them dancing. So this shot and this shot lives in this same universe of the window. And we know now that the window is the hottest part of the room. We know that this is supposed to be, for the audience, this is a day interior shot, right? And look how down it is. They are living consistently 2 stops under, from the close-ups to the record player, and even to this, right? So we see now the window, the shears, are the hottest part of the image, right? We know because we can see it. The EL zone is showing this. In fact, it's actually clipping out. 6 stops over is now clipping on that ARRI sensor. But it's an ARRI sensor. It arguably has the best dynamic range of all digital sensors, right, available to us as filmmakers, cinematographers, okay? So it's maintaining it a little bit, but it is 6 stops over these little hardcore hot spots, right? But that's the hottest spot of the room, hands down. And then we can see it's kind of mellowing out on the shears, but we see in here, they're consistently keeping with that 2 stop under for the skin, right? The skin on the back of her dress because it's opened up there, the skin on his face, he's facing away from the window, right? And certainly when we get into this, 2 stops under, her, just a little bit of 2 stops under, but again, she's really being, you know, a lot of shadow on her from his body holding her, right? And even here, 2 stops under, the record player, consistently 2 stops under, even this when he walks in. So now in this world, I believe the window is over here somewhere, and it's still, you know, they're still selling that 2 under look, because we know by just standing in a room, if you were facing the window, you would not be 2 stops under, right? Maybe if you're that far away, maybe. But you certainly wouldn't have all this control of all of this under, right? And then, you know, but notice how he's matching the rest of this environment, right? This, the only hot spot is this little practical on the wall here. And we got a little bit of hot light coming down from this hallway, right? So the nuance of this is what's important to pay attention to, right? Because what they love to do in Hollywood is you go, okay, this is the world we're living in, and you got to think about the motivation of the room, right? So they're like, yeah, and also you got to think about depth and layers. So they have the light on up here in the hallway. It's coming down. We feel that hotter exposure, and it's falling off as it's coming down the hallway. I'm talking about the light. We have this little practical on here, but we know, like, okay, but he's facing this way, and there's a little bit of light on him that matches the wall here. So we know that there's something happening over here, right? And then when we come in, we know, like, okay, it's this window. Right? But the point here is the consistency of 2 stops under across the board. Keep in mind, this is on the ARRI LogC. But that's the point of dynamic range, guys. That's the point. If your camera cannot underexpose by 2 stops and still deliver a usable image, you need a new camera. Okay? That's the whole point of dynamic range. Knowing where you want to shift it, right? There's this argument of, we should always be shooting at the native ISO. If your camera is limited that way, then great. Then I guess you should do that. But most cinema cameras are malleable, right? They're meant to be pushed and pulled to kind of replicate the film days. That's the whole point of the ASC's breakdown of, again, the video I did of how to understand the ISO, how to use the ISO to your advantage. But it involves a pretty extensive pre-production test of that specific camera. Again, you can check that out. But this is with the EL Zone on the show LUT. So this is where they brought it down. Now they're bringing it down 3 stops. They're bringing it down a whole nother stop under, bringing it down more. And they're able to do that because of the dynamic range of the camera, right? So, if a camera has 12 stops, right, and we've all seen the charts, it's going to change based upon whatever ISO you're rating it at. But it's never going to be limited to, oh no, you got to stay right on middle gray, right? That's insanity, right? If you're always staying at middle gray, not only will your images have consistent flatness to them in terms of ratios, it certainly won't have nuance, but you're also not taking advantage of that camera in certain different lighting scenarios. I've made videos long ago, back in my Pocket 4K days, on understanding the dynamic range of the Pocket 4K's dual native ISO. Different ISOs, depending on the camera, will give you better performance, sometimes in the upper region, and other ISOs will give you better performance in the lower region. The native ISO idea comes from, well, that's where it's the most balanced. But if you really wanted to start pushing the camera to the limits, right, and using it in a more creative, artistic fashion, then you would do your own ISO test, not a dynamic range test, an ISO test. They're very different. Again, video linked below. And you will understand, like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I might get the most equal ups and downs of the under and over if I stay on that native ISO. But what you might notice is if you go just one way to the left, well, now I got an extra stop in the highlights, which that might be beneficial for you. Or if you go this way, you might find, and I'm talking about the ISO scale, if you go under the native ISO, then you might get an additional stop in the underexposed areas, right? This is what I'm talking about, guys. They're not always shooting at the native ISO, and they're not always capturing everything at middle gray. You just would not have the nuance that modern cinematography has. Okay, moving on. So here's a great example of the kid looking out the window. Okay, he's looking out the window, and I think this is great because it's like, yeah, the reality is this window, sitting that close to a window, you would be lit up, right? And the whole point is, too, is that look at this window. The window itself is 4 stops over. He is right on top of it, but we have so much controlled nuance here. They're keeping the consistency of that 2 stops under, of just getting that little Rembrandt there, and the rest is just falling away to 3 and 4 stops under. This is looking at the EL Zone on the ARRI LogC. Now I know with the color space transform and all that, it won't be exact, but this is getting us pretty damn close to the reality of how it was shot. Here's another day interior, okay? Now this is a little bit more realistic because we can see this side of his face facing the window. He is getting a little hot here. We're now pushing 2 stops over, but the majority of it is only 1 stop over, which is actually perfect. If we look on the EL Zone, it actually lives in the normal exposure for lighter skin tones. So this is the one chance where we're getting somewhere with a normal exposure on his skin. However, the majority of his face is living in this 3 stop under region. Total Godfather eyes here with the raccoon eyes, right? This is the look of the show, right? This is the nuance of the show. This is another product shot. He's holding the switchblade. Okay, again, behind him is, the back of the wall where the window is, and we have all of this kind of 1 stop over light, but as it falls on the blade, it's just falling off into nothing. But notice the one little sheen they're making sure to get in there that is living in that -1, -2 zone under, just so you can get a little bit of glint so you can still make out what it is, right? Here, I believe this was a night interior. It may look like a night exterior because it looks like a back alleyway. However, I believe this was still the inside of this weird abandoned warehouse. I'm pretty sure this is a night interior. Either way, it is nighttime regardless. And yeah, this is just a good idea just to see how dark they were literally capturing the world on the day. The good thing here is the positioning of him to the majority of the room tone of this area. But again, the room tone is consistent with that 2 stops under. So now we know, what does this tell us? We're seeing a pattern here of 2 stops under. Well, what we're seeing is, if we recall, the contrast ratios. So again, I'll leave all the links to my past videos down below. But if we remember, a 2-stop difference is a 4:1 contrast ratio. So what that means is, in the pre-production process, when the DP is sitting down, having conversations with the gaffer, having conversations with the director, having conversations with the production designer, he wants to consistently maintain this 4:1 contrast ratio, this 2-stop difference, right? And we see it. We see the pattern. We're seeing it. I'm not making this stuff up. This is a day interior where he is inside the mansion place. This ties in with another scene, so I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit. But again, we'll see later on, there is a window over here on this side, okay? And the majority of the light is coming in that way. I should have picked a different color. Is this better? Yeah, this is better. Okay, there's a window over here, right? And we feel it. You know, the fall off on his face is so nice. But notice, only this little bit is finally hitting middle gray. This tiny bit, the little bit of sheen on his cheek, is hitting that normal skin tone level of half to 1 stop over. And the rest is having that wonderful fall off to our consistent 4:1 contrast ratio of 2 stops under. Okay, so now here's an interesting one. This is a day exterior. Clearly, he's walking out, he's getting into the car. And even in the day exteriors, notice how there is just so much control being done here. This could depend on the time of day that it was captured, or as we all know, these guys have buku bucks on HBO Max. This is big, big money, huge dollar bills, y'all. The big, big trucks are out. The big boys are playing with their big toys, and they probably have insane butterfly nets, 20 by 20s. You could just imagine the amount of gear that is being out on this for this amount of control on this. And we're still getting this nice sheen, this nice reflection on the actual window. But at the end of the day, we are maintaining the consistency of the 2 stops under on the skin of our hero. And again, even on this, the window reflection, okay? Again, we're maintaining that consistency. We have the control. Only little glints of the, normal exposure skin tone for Caucasian skin of 1 stop over. The majority of that, and just instantly falling off into that perfect side split lighting. And then back around to this, again, I mean, we just see it over and over, the same consistent lighting, the same kind of letting the shadows go, letting the raccoon eyes happen, maintaining this 4:1 contrast ratio. This massive day interior, I believe this was a day interior. This is another interesting one to kind of see how they handle the room tone. This look kind of reminds me of when I broke down Dune Part 2. Now on that one, I did not reverse engineer it, so I was just looking at the show look, so that one may have more controversy around it. Again, however, I did dial in Rec 79 in the ozone. Regardless, this reminds me of Dune Part 2, the way that this is lit, the way that they're kind of balancing to the stone structure and letting the practicals and this outside light really do the work for them. But however, we do know that, there's a big portion of the ceiling that we're not seeing, and that's probably where a lot of this is coming from. The true room tone of the room, which is actually giving us, middle gray and 1 stop over. It's coming from the part of the ceiling we're not seeing, right? Because, we know that this shot, we know that he came down these stairs, right? He came down these stairs, he walked right through there, and now he's walking into the darkness, right? So we know, like, okay, if this is the central part of the region of the frame being captured, every frame being a painting, so to speak, and we remember, like, if we think of this in rule of thirds, well, yeah, they're putting that right on the axis for his main point of entrance and then walking into the shadows. Again, here's another shot. Consistently 2 stops under. It doesn't matter if it's interior day, exterior day, they're maintaining this contrast ratio throughout. A lot of side split lighting, we feel it here. So here, back to our car scene, our kid here with a day, this is technically a day interior, this would be like a day interior / day exterior. He's in the car, but the car is in day exterior, right? But notice this level of nuance. He's looking in the back window, and if we see okay, that's with the show look, right? This is how far they brought it down with the show look. This is with it on the ARRI LogC. But then if we see what he's looking at, right? So this is the log C of where he's looking directly into darkness. We still got a little bit of highlight there. They got their Roscoe dash and dot going on. But then if we jump here, we see the world he's looking at, still a heavy amount of control. A lot of this is also down to the direction of where they decide to shoot in relation to the direction of the sun. This is a restaurant day interior. And again, this is a prime example of the classic having the top light be pushed back this way, right? So they're pushing the top light back so that way it's falling on the upstage side, right? You notice the camera side is the falling off into shadow 3 and 4 stops under. However, that consistent 2 stops under of the key side is with the key light pushed back a little bit, so it's not sitting directly over them, it's just pushed back a little bit, hella control with skirts and, egg crate grids, and they're getting that consistent fall off. And, the only thing that is hard with this show is that the skin tone being 2 stops under and the walls being 2 stops under, in my opinion, in my artistic, subjective, judgmental opinion, it can get a little muddy, right? Because there's no real separation of these guys popping out from the background because the 4:1 contrast ratio is the whole thing, right? That would be kind of my thing about it. But again, this is how it's being captured. Here it is with the log C. So we know it is, they're maintaining it's the same ratio on their faces that it is on the background. Lots of pracs. But then if we look at so how they're making it pop away, rather than with exposure, they're making their faces pop away from the background by using color, right? So that's a thing that I guess you can do in big boy Hollywood, right? Is because the reality is we knew that by looking at the EL zone, they're balancing the walls to the same 2 stops under that they're balancing the key side of their faces. Me, personally, that would be something that I would want to try to have a little bit of variance in, even if the wall is just a half a stop darker than their key side of their faces. I think that would give us a little bit of extra variance of letting them pop away from the background a little bit. However, that does require a hell of a lot more control, obviously. But, however, they're still doing it. Maybe they're using masks in Resolve or something like that. Or obviously, we can tell just by looking at that they are managing the separation with color. Moving on. This is all the same scene. So this is the show look. This is the log C. This is the show look when he turns around. That's the same kind of positioning. Now he's facing towards the light, right? So this is nice placement, beautiful shadow side. But then he's facing towards the light, which is her. So now we get this kind of not so nice dynamic look. You can see the difference of prime example of what it looks like when you shoot into the shadow side versus when you shoot into the key side, right? But it makes sense because, she's lit up back here. So they are maintaining some sort of consistency there. And then the close up on her. And then when he stands up, so this is him when he's sitting there, and notice her white dress it's white. You would think that it would be much hotter, but they are controlling it. Again, this is probably done in studio, right? So they have the ability to control this versus just working with a real window. But you could still do it with a real window with real sunlight, but it'd be much harder. It would be much harder to maintain that same consistency of light throughout the day. You generally don't want to work with real sunlight if you don't have to, right? You just you make it seem like you're working with real sunlight, but you're not, right? That's how they're able to maintain this level on her throughout the day, because this is, real Hollywood, they'll take all day to shoot 4 to 5 pages. It's just how it goes. Oh, the luxury. Wouldn't that be great? But this is what's going on. Middle gray on her, just hitting half a stop over. And as he's looking towards that direction, he's starting to get a little bit of that same exposure on his face. Wonderful control here. We are maintaining that consistency of 2 stops under on our hero here. We can see when he turns this way, even when he turns towards the light, it is still giving us that consistent 4:1 contrast ratio, 2 stops under on his face. Still getting that raccoon eye, that Godfather look. Now we're getting in on her. This is with the show LUT, and this is with the ARRI LogC. So even with the show LUT, we are maintaining that 4:1 contrast ratio, but much darker blacks, versus the log where they're obviously we're not letting it crush out as bad. But still, we have the raccoon eyes even on her. We still got the little eye light on her. We still got that same kind of top light 4:1 contrast ratio going on. So we don't need to keep breaking all this down. We've noticed the pattern with this show now. We've identified that this show has a 4:1 contrast ratio, aka 2 stops under. You can identify all that. You can identify the kind of Godfather look with this consistency, this pattern of raccoon eyes, this pattern of side lighting, lots of Rembrandt lighting going on. We have identified that, and we've identified the patterns. So this is one of the main objectives. You know, it takes you a step beyond just looking at screen grabs off of Shot Deck or IMDb or something like that. You can really get in here and really see what they're doing. If we look at this last one, which is a huge windows, day interior here at in the prison or the asylum, even those windows that they're letting it go, right? If we look here, they're really letting it go. And the beauty of this is the people facing the camera, they are maintaining that contrast ratio of 2 stops under, and all of this, they're just letting this go. And the funny thing is, this is where the actual action is, right? But keep in mind, again, this also reminds me of Dune Part 2. Huh, that's funny. Also a Greig Fraser, right? And this cinematography of this show is completely inspired by Greig Fraser because he shot the original The Batman that these characters were taken from. And when we think about Dune Part 2, there were direct examples in that breakdown as well. Again, I'll link that down below. But when we think about a painting, an image, if we think back to Bob Ross, right, we know that the beauty of a good painting is making the darker images in the front, and then as you get deeper into the frame, your scene gets brighter, right? And that's just a classic Bob Ross painting technique. So he put the dark trees in the foreground, right? And then by putting the brighter colors in the back and layering them, much like they did with this shot here, it's really adding to the visual depth of the shot. Okay, so study your painting, study your EL zone, do the reverse engineering with a simple color space transform node in Resolve, and maybe check out some awesome classes over there on Skillshare. Again, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. I hope you guys got something out of this. I hope this was beneficial. I hope this is helpful for you in your own studying, in your own pre-production process, because we're all using references, right? So if Shot Deck is such a cool thing, I think just using EL Zone on the reverse engineering of those images is going to be even more beneficial, right? So, and this is very free to do. I pulled all these screen grabs directly off of IMDb, and EL Zone is free if you have a small HD monitor, and I think they started putting it in other monitors as well nowadays. So there you go. Okay, guys, thank you for the support. If you're new here, consider hitting that subscribe button, because if you're still watching at this point, then I think that you're probably a fan of this channel by now. Otherwise, you would have clicked off long ago. So the best way to support the show is to just tap that subscribe button. Or if you want to go even more depth on a weekly basis, I do have a huge archive, over 200 videos on my weekly Patreon. So you can check that out at patreon.com/JustinPhillip. Thank you all. I got to get out of here.